All right, please take a seat, everyone. Our next panel, we're about to begin. We're going to be talking about how wash rights are girls' and women's rights. Last call. Last call for coffee. We're going to go ahead and get started. I want to introduce our panelists. Please, folks, if you could take a seat. So today we have Kelly Parsons, CEO of WaterAid America. Woo-hoo, who has a cheerleading section. Yay! We also have Naomi Tulay-Solanke. She is the founder and executive director of the Community Healthcare Initiative, which has worked in Liberia since 2014. Welcome, Naomi. And now everyone gets a clap. We also have Anita Sonia. She is a Kenyan climate activist and UN WASH Global Youth Champion who founded the Sonia Foundation. Welcome, Anita. And last but not least, we have Abby Maxman, who is President and CEO of Oxfam America. So thank you, everyone, for joining us. And let's go ahead and get started. So the panel, WASH rights are women and girls' rights. It seems very obvious, but is not always. And I think it's interesting kind of breaking down these two interrelated challenges. You've got WASH that tends to fly under the radar, and then unfortunately you have the rights of women and girls, which also tends to fly under the radar. So you've got this double whammy of a challenge. And as we know, unfortunately, WASH tends to disproportionately impact women and girls. There's the danger aspect of women who go fetching water or using toilets outside. Menstruating can mean the difference between going to school and not going to school. So, let's talk about some of these very distinct challenges. I'd just like to get your take on how your particular organization is tackling them, some real life examples, and what have been some of the main barriers that you've encountered. Kelly, can we go ahead and start with you?
Sure. Yep, sounds like I'm on. Yeah, okay. First, just super brief overview of WaterAid. We work in about 25 countries around the world, and we work hand in hand with communities to install water sanitation systems that are locally owned, repaired, and operated and maintained. In simple, our model is to build some, to strengthen systems as we go along, and to overinvest in influencing in order to scale the rest of that success. The way in which we approach water and gender and the integration of WASH and gender is just recognition of the fact that in developing countries, women and girls are responsible for the vast majority of collection and carrying of water in 80% of households. It accounts for 15 hours a week of their time on average. I translated that into a percentage of working hours, and it's about 15 or waking hours, it's 15%. And so I spent a minute this morning just thinking about what would I do if I got 15% more time in my everyday back. And I would encourage you all to think about that, but that's a size of the problem as we think about that. And every day globally, women and girls spend 200 million hours collecting water. So that's a massive hit on GDP and growth, and it's a massive hit to the potential of girls and women all over the world. So what do we do about that? We make sure that our programming, wherever possible, integrates the particular needs of girls and women. We make sure their voices are key in helping to design and develop our programming, that they're at the table and leading often in the maintenance and operations and the ongoing system strengthening. So where possible, we'll build a women's water collective that's leading in terms of that community management of the system. And then we're advocating constantly and linking the issues of WASH and women and girls around the world.
Great, thank you. Naomi, can you talk a bit about your work in Liberia? You've been there quite a while.
Thank you. Again, I work in Liberia, but I also serve on the Sanitation and Hygiene Fund Board. So how we work, we are intentional about the way we work, especially with girls and women, because Fortunately for us, when we work with women and girls, the issues that affect them around menstrual health, it resonates with us because we have been through that. So one of the things that we have been able to do is that we have been able to work with women first to work on the taboo, the misconception about menstrual health, and also ensuring that we are putting women in small cooperative groups. We realize that when women come together, they will learn and unlearn collectively. And what's important about the small cooperative groups that the women work in, they produce reusable sanitary pads for sale. But it's not just only the selling, the economic part of that whole process, is that the women in those various communities serve as a means of information dissemination to girls who are then seeing the period, and they are helping to get rid of the taboo, the conversation, and we see that more people are having conversation around menstrual health. So we are intentional that when the women are empowered and they sell the menstrual product, the reusable part, which is also eco-friendly, it come back where the girls can now get to them and they have conversation around menstrual health and hygiene. I think this is something that we are proud of, and this is some of the ideas we carry to the SHF board, that the SHF is passionate about ensuring that in as much that we are talking about hygiene and washing sanitation, that menstrual health is prioritized.
And such a great example of how this is such a cross-cutting issue with health, not only that, but climate change, and looking at recycling. Thank you. Anita, you obviously must work with a lot of young people. You've started your own foundation. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Okay, so I have been a climate activist and a climate advocate for quite some time in Kenya. And during the general election, where I also ran for office on a Green Party, which is not normal. In Africa, Green parties don't win elections as that now. But then it's during that time that I got to understand the nexus between climate, water, and other social issues. And that is when I decided to start a foundation aside from the organization that runs environmental activities. And when I also got my new role as a global youth champion for SWA, it really gave me an opportunity to connect with communities and understand different challenges. And most of the challenges that are being talked about in these rooms are the things that we see firsthand in our own community. I come from the Maasai community in Kenya, where culture is still a very strong thing. It's the same community where they find it difficult to elect women, or maybe we have these kind of some roles don't belong to women, and women's work is to fetch water, stay at home, make sure the families are okay, and all that. And you realize that even girls are missing school because of lack of menstrual products. And does not only end at that, they may get the menstrual products where people donate and all that, but without the water, then there's no hygiene, and without hygiene, then health issues. So just looking at how everything is interrelated. And currently, one of the toughest thing to handle, even when on ground, is listening to stories of women and girls where girls have to have sex for pads, and then their mothers on the other side are having sex for water, and they come back in the evening home, and then you realize it's a broken family where they're not okay, they're not feeling okay doing it, but then sextortion is a thing. So it's really a very challenging thing. But to look at, for me, what really it means to empower women and girls through water and sanitation is first removing the barriers that women and girls have.
Thank you. And that's such a powerful personal story that really brings to light a lot of the talk that we have had over these last few days. Abby, I think too, Anita mentioned a lot of how this intersects with so many other issues. Can you talk just in general about Oxfam's work with women and girls in WASH, and also just how that is such a cross-cutting sector?
Yeah, absolutely. This notion of WASH rights or women's and girls' rights are really central to Oxfam's work. We work in 90 countries around the world, and we take an intersectional approach, looking at climate justice, gender justice, economic justice, and rights and dignity in crisis. And we know what's happening around the world right now. If you just take the Horn of Africa, where drought, we're going into potentially the 6th year of consecutive drought. And the hungriest people in the world, in the region, are the thirstiest people in the region. And we know that all of these issues intersect. So we work on system strengthening. We work with communities in the hardest to reach places, but we also work with displaced populations, because many, if we just look in the Horn of Africa right now, have been displaced. They're losing their ancestral livelihoods because the consecutive years of drought, which is a byproduct of a climate crisis that they did nothing to cause, are forcing them to finally abandon their lives and livelihoods as they've long known them. And when I was in Somalia a couple months ago, met a woman named Sophia, a mother of 8, who had actually withstood 4 years of drought, and finally had to abandon her livelihood and move to the Durdur refugee camp. And so we end up obviously helping her where she is, providing water for women and families in the camps. But when she fled, she told me that what forced her to finally flee was her livestock, her remaining 4 livestock. She had lost 90%. And her children had become so weak that hyenas were circling them at night. Hyenas. This is an injustice that none of us should see in the 21st century. And so for us, it's a rights issue, and it's a gender issue, and it's a justice issue.
Now, to follow up on that note, are you seeing, I mean, we obviously have this conference now, are you seeing improvement in terms of coordination among agencies, among INGOs, recognizing that it's less siloed, at least in terms of climate change, in terms of health, in terms of WASH? Have you seen some positive movements on that front, or still a lot to be desired?
Well, there's mechanisms and systems in place. We know things like the WASH cluster, if we look in the humanitarian sector. And I will give you another example. I was in Ethiopia recently, in Gambela, in western Ethiopia, where there's a large South Sudanese refugee population. And the coordination mechanisms have been there, but I want to intersect this conversation around financing, because the expectations they had tried to consolidate and not have we like to ensure we're supporting and working with local partners, but the pressures on financing meant UNHCR had one organization only take over all water management with 40% cuts to funding and manage all the water systems across all the camps. And so this actually displaced local partners. It's actually, we work with communities and refugee communities there who have said very clearly that they know their good WASH protocol, but no longer were there resources for soap, and so they had to start using ash again. And hygiene and sanitation products were missing. And so the pressures on the financing, I think, are having an adverse effect on coordination and the approaches that we actually support in terms of local humanitarian leadership, having women's rights organizations and local-led organizations at the forefront of the action. But the financing pressures are forcing kind of negative incentives of how the systems and coordinations are working.
So actually on that point in terms of financing, we've talked, our previous panel was on investment in WASH, and we've heard some of the figures of what's needed on an annual basis, and it's a huge, huge figure. Where do you, Kelly, what do you see as the role of the private sector? Because WASH is generally not seen as much of much interest with the private sector.
I think the role of the private sector is going to be huge. And I think Abby mentioned it was a finance issue, it's a cross-sectoral health education issue, but it's also an economic issue. And I think one of the things that the burden is on us to make the case for private sector investment in WASH. We have a fantastic 5-year program that we did with USAID, GAP, and WaterAid India, where we worked along GAP's value chain and supported women-led community development and WASH-centric community-led development that changed hundreds and thousands of lives. And Gap is very proud of that program. They're now trying to scale up a second version of that program. But it's just an example of where it brought a return on investment to the company to do the right thing. I think we have some data from a recent study that we did, boosting the business case for WASH, that showed in some places as much as a 30% increase in productivity when corporates bring WASH programming into their value chain and into their workers' lives. And especially when you start looking at the impact of women and girls on that, it's just going to have an enormous. So I think the burden's on us, but the private sector's there, and I think their role is going to be huge moving forward.
Naomi, could you also talk about the private sector, but not just corporates, but local businesses as well that you've encountered in your work?
I think that we cannot expect global sustainability without ensuring sustainable development for all. Investment in a sanitation economy can in fact deliver the returns not only for economic livelihood, but also invest into community coming together in a way that is unique. When you talk about people living in refugee camps, investing in the sanitation economy, imagine using the local approach, the local people who are the ones going to be producing those sanitary materials that is locally procured. You are investing within their own community. So I think most often whenever we hear about the sanitation economy, especially for us at the local level, we are usually giving things. But if you look within our surrounding, what we are accustomed to using, it can also be invested in, and you see that the resources remain in the community, and the community can grow. So I think it's about time that we start to invest locally and using the local material and investing where we see that there's a need. I think the need for sanitation is global, but you will know that in the global south and in countries that have crisis, it's actually needed. Yeah.
So on that train of thought in terms of local as well, we also have to deal with local cultural and societal barriers. There's taboos, as you know, of course, on sanitation, on hygiene, on menstruation specifically. What do you think, Anita, what do you think are some of the best ways that we can confront these cultural taboos?
Okay, so first of all, I think there's need to be education in the rural areas. Personally, in my foundation, that is what we do, apart from just helping the girls with menstrual products. Apart from, recently we adopted a school where we buy them, we do monthly supply of water so that they can be able to cook and have food in school and all that. But then we realized that if we don't educate the parents to understand why they also need to have their girls go to school like the boys, then it becomes nothing, because we can just have the talking from the school level when the parents have to release them to go to school. So another example is we have one lady who's part of our project who a few years ago had a chance to travel to India to learn about water engineering from the community. And when she came back to the community, she was able to train trainers of trainers, about 47 of them, and then the 47 of them have more women behind them. And you realize that the thing was on water shortage. And you know that we've had the worst drought in 40 years right now, and they needed to put food on the table because they still are the providers for the family. And so she taught the community about the kitchen gardens, and so we helped to support her to see that she can be able to reach more trainers of trainers in different villages, so that women can be able to produce food with little water that they have, and this reduces also the risk that maybe they are going to stay hungry and all that. And I also think we also have in the discussion on gender, women and girls, we don't leave out any other gender outside, because we believe we've seen this becoming a gender war, especially where I work, where when you talk about women empowerment and girls empowerment, it becomes war of gender A versus gender B. But then we are trying to make it like all genders united for a common goal, which I think is very important.
Thank Thank you. Abby, what are some of your thoughts as well on these cultural barriers and tackling them?
Well, just picking up on Anita's comment, we know we have decades of data of what works. And we also know on empowering women and girls, making sure men and boys are involved as well, obviously. But also we know when WASH works for women, families, communities are healthier and wealthier. It's so simple. And we need to actually, I think at a global level, really redouble or be more creative about how we look at investing and seeing it as an investment, and especially as we look at these intersecting issues of the climate crisis, economic and gender injustice that we see happening. And we can reverse it, but there's the negative spiral of, it becomes more costly in human lives and livelihoods lost, and then we're in a vicious cycle, and we have to reverse that trend. And working with approaches that work with local organizations, women-led women's rights organizations, and make sure that's where we're investing. We know who is at the front lines, who knows best. We know who's there at times of crisis and who's there to nurture their families. And that's where the investment needs to be.
And we've also touched on all day climate change and its impact in general on WASH. How has climate change affected your work within WASH and women and girls over the years? Kelly?
It's making all of it harder, and I think women and girls are likely to be living on the front line of climate change. They're experiencing the cycles of drought and flooding more immediately than communities are, but they are at the front line of their families also, and so they see and live and have to manage day to day the family health crises that emerge, or the loss of livelihoods that emerge as a result of this. I think the challenge for the sector really is, how do we integrate climate change and gender into WASH programming, and then change that sentence around. How do we integrate WASH programming into climate and gender development efforts? Because all these silos just aren't working.
Naomi, have you had to adapt your own programming and your own work over the years? How has that impacted you?
So over the years, what have happened to us? We are experiencing flooding. So while other people are experiencing, other countries are experiencing droughts, we are experiencing heavy rainfall. And then for the girls and women that are using the reusable pad, it don't get dry on time. And then they are stuck. Yeah. So what we have been able to do is that it's also it's also costly for them. They use we locally do that, the fire hot, where you do like the heating, so there where they hang the lining. So then we have to work with communities and family around the issue of privacy, because some community, you cannot just talk about menstrual health, open it. And then you're talking about the women using the product after they have used the pad, the reusable pad, they need to hang it in the space that everybody is using, maybe for cooking or warming, to allow it to dry. So we are seeing that climate change in a way have affected some of the way that we work. But the silver lining to that part is that the girls and women always have access to sanitary pads than the disposable ones. The disposable pads are good, but after single use, that's it. They are staying away from school because they don't have pad. But with the reusable pad, they stay in school. It provides economic livelihood for the community. Women and girls have safe space where they can have the conversation around water, sanitation, and hygiene. So that's the silver lining. Yeah.
Anita, what are some of the things you've seen?
Yeah. Personally, I can say the biggest effects that we've had is drought, and it has had us having to choose, because you have to choose whether to buy food or take that child to school, because you no longer have enough food like you used to before, and it has really made it very difficult. Last week, I visited one of the families that we support, and it was very devastating, because the previous time we visited, about a year ago, they had about 200 cows, and when we got there were no cows at all. But then you could see the skeletons of the cows just out there. You could see the family very hopeless. The children could not even talk. Everybody was crying because they really don't know where do we start, which one do we handle first. So it's I can say for me, climate change has really affected not only my community, not only my work, but the people who are very close to us. When we are talking about access to education, they don't want to listen to that because how do I go to school on an empty stomach? And for example, I said before about the school we adopted. We went to the school initially because we were going to adopt the girls and their parents to give them monthly supply of menstrual products. Reason we adopted the parents as well is because we realized you give the girls, but they still miss school because they have to share the little that you gave them with their parents. And when we got there, that was not the main challenge. They had food in the store, but they couldn't cook because they do not have the water. So you then realize that there are so many challenges, but all brought about by water shortage. And it's really devastating to see, yeah.
Now, Abby, we're hearing so many of these powerful stories this week, and there's supposed to be the water action agenda. There's a lot on the agenda. Whether it's actionable it remains to be seen. Do you think that women and girls are being incorporated into this discussion this week and the agenda? And what are some of your hopes and concerns of what comes of this?
Well, I think it's up to us to make sure and hold everybody, ourselves and those who are here this week, and not just this week, over time, accountable that the needs and the rights of women and girls are taken into account. We have to make sure that the gendered needs are considered in all the work we do and actually lift up at the big macro meta policy level so that, I mean, the story you just told, it is not just heartbreaking, it's immoral what is happening. We need to bring our outrage to places of power where we're sitting right now and make the situation be heard. But look, when we say, oh, there's not money, there's plenty of money. We have billionaires self-financing their own projects to send themselves into space. There is plenty of money. What we have is extreme inequality and systems that are not working for the majority of people. And so we have to look at the big issues of climate financing, loss and damage, those who are least responsible, like the family you visited last week, who are losing their livelihoods when we know we have to debunk the myth that there's no resources. It's a question of political will and community action, and we can really, I think, shift the narrative and hold ourselves accountable to create a new system where we are investing in the lives and livelihoods in a more human economy.
Anita, what do you hope the message and the action happens after this conference wraps up?
I will say that I hope that everybody becomes willing to be held accountable. I hope that they don't find being held accountable as something like pressure or something negative, because that is what we need. At SWA, we push for action, ambition, action, but then we say without accountability, then we may not have the action. Yeah.
We've certainly heard that word a lot today. Likewise, Naomi and Kelly, what are some of that you hope are takeaways from this conference?
I think we need to move from voice to action. We have all heard the story. We can read it. Social media have connected the world in a way that you can sit and just Google where it's drought happening right now, what is flood happening right now, and you can see we need to move from voice to action. It's time that we walk the talk. Yeah.
And Kelly, some final thoughts?
I think I want to create a T-shirt that says "Wash Girl Boss," because there's a lot of Wash Girl Bosses at this conference, and I've loved seeing that from all around the world. And the level of dialogue going on is elevated and is what we need. And so we ourselves as a sector need to set the right tone and set the right pace. And I'll just mention, I had the privilege of joining Vice President Harris when she launched the presidential water action plan, trying to get those words right. And in the room was a vice president, a woman of color, and a woman. our first. A head of DOD, female. Head of USAID, female. Head of Millennium Challenge Corporation, female. Head of NOAA, female. It was awesome, and I have a great picture from that, and one of my favorite things about that picture is just looking at that lineup and thinking, wow, this administration is pushing the boundaries and opening up ways for us to continue to push the boundaries through our own NGOs and through our own work and efforts. But we have a long way to go, but I think there's hope, and there's certainly a lot of girl bosses around this conference.
I think wholeheartedly agree. Thank you, ladies.